Okay, good morning. My name is Brian Kalinowski. I'm the police chief here with the city of Galt. And with me today is former Chief Doug Matthews with the Galt Police Department, Captain Rick Small, Lieutenant John Rocha, and Detective Mark Fuel, who's the current lead on this case. In addition, I have with me District Attorney Schubert from the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. Today we're here to talk about a cold case that we had in the city of Galt regarding a rape and murder of a 79-year-old female that occurred on or about May 23rd, 1988. So I'm going to go into the details of that with you here today. On Monday, May 23rd, 1988, Galt police officers were dispatched to the 500 block of Poplar Street here in Galt regarding a deceased female. The female was identified as victim Lucille Holtgren, and she was located deceased on the bed in the master bedroom of her residence. She was located by two friends who had come to check on her after she didn't attend church the previous day. The friends were able to enter the residence through a slightly open sliding glass door on the east side of the residence, and Holtgren had visible injuries to her chest, and it had appeared that she'd been sexually assaulted. After extensive investigation, witnesses being contacted, and other traditional investigative means, we were also assisted by the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office Crime Scene Investigations Unit and the California Department of Justice, who both assisted in collection of evidence at the scene. The coroner's opinion at that time was that the death occurred 2 to 5 days prior to the discovery, and that the cause of death was stab wounds to the chest and strangulation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Lucille. As I mentioned earlier, she was a 79-year-old female at the time of her passing, and she'd been a Galt resident for about 25 years. She'd moved to the area from Ohio with her family. She had lived on Poplar Street with her husband, Frank, until his passing in October of 1987. They had 2 adult sons. Lucille was active in the community, and especially in her church. And as mentioned before, it was her missing church that caused her friends to come check on her. Through some DNA identification that the district attorney will talk about, we've identified the suspect as Terry Leroy Bramble with a date of birth of 7/18/1956, who at the time of the crime was 32 years old. Bramble's been a longtime resident and a transient of Galt, and was so until he died of natural causes in October of 2011. We had obtained, and more will be talked about with the DA's office, his DNA was on file from a sexual assault conviction that occurred from a case in 1992 that occurred in San Joaquin County. He was a registered sex offender. Evidence from this case, as this was a cold case from time to time, went to the lab in Sacramento and re-examined, and it wasn't until new procedures were in place and techniques used that we were able to identify Mr. Bramble as our suspect. I will turn it over to our district attorney now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning, everyone. Nearly 70 years ago, in 1953, a fairly famous forensic scientist by the name of Paul Kirk said, "Wherever he steps, wherever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. Not only his fingerprints or his footprints, but his hair, the fibers from his clothes, the glass that he breaks, the tool mark that he leaves, the paint that he scratches, the blood or the semen that he deposits, all of these and more bear mute witness against him. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. It is factual evidence. Physical evidence cannot be wrong. It cannot perjure itself. It cannot be wholly absent. Only human failure to find it, to study it, to understand it can diminish its value. I start with those words and that quote because that is what this case is about. It is about the pursuit of justice for over 30 plus years and the examination of physical evidence that ultimately led to the identification of the sex offender that killed Lucille Holmgren. For nearly 2 decades, our crime lab, the Sacramento County DA's crime lab, worked extensively to examine, to study, and to meticulously find the evidence that was necessary in this case. Our crime lab, led by one of our criminalists, more recently Nikki Sewell, and overseen by our cold case unit and our assistant chief deputy, Amy Holliday, included looking at her autopsy kit, the bedding that she was found on, a body bag, the clothing that she wore, including a sweater, a blouse, and a skirt. It included looking at the pillowcase that was placed over her head when she was killed, as well as a sleeping bag, a comforter, and ultimately fingernail scrapings from her body. In that time frame, since 1988, clearly the science has gotten better, it's become more meticulous, and our ability to solve this case became a reality. Last year, at the end of the year, I ran into retired detective, lieutenant, was he a lieutenant? Up to Grove. And he told me about this case and that they had worked it extensively. And in going back to that, more work was done. And I give great credit to the Galt Police Department, our crime lab, and our cold case unit. And ultimately, through the examination of the fingernail scrapings that were collected from Mrs. Holmgren's body, the sex offender that was identified has now come to light as her killer. The fingernails were the key to solving this case. We come here today, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. There are perhaps some of you as reporters that were not even born in 1988. But we in public safety pursue justice no matter where it leads us, no matter how long it takes us. To put into perspective the 33 years, 11 months, and 24 days since her body was found, I remind you of some simple facts of what it was like in 1988 here, in this country, in this state, in this community, in this city. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan was the president. George Bush was running against Michael Dukakis. A gallon of gasoline cost 91 cents. The price of a new house averaged $91,000. After an 8-year war, the Soviet Union had decided to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. DNA, this concept of DNA, had just started to be talked about in the world of law enforcement. Never in California had it ever been introduced in 1988. There was no such thing as this thing we call the DNA data bank, which now has solved well over perhaps 80,000 crimes, almost 100,000 crimes. Here in Sacramento in 1988, that news that seemed to dominate, at least in the fall of 1988, was the arrest of a serial killer by the name of Dorothea Puente, who killed upwards of 9 elderly and mentally disabled men and buried them in her backyard. Here in Galt in 1988, the population was somewhere around a little less than 9,000. It encompassed somewhere between 2 to 5 square miles. It's a small community. The history of this city perhaps hasn't changed much. It's about faith and family and raising your children in a safe community. Much of it is about farming as well. And while all of these historical and factual events are important to recognize, we are here today because of one person and her family, and that is Lucille Holmgren. As the chief mentioned, she was 79 years old, sexually assaulted, strangled to death, and stabbed to death in her own home, the home she had owned for 25 years. Her husband had just died a few months previous. She had 2 children, 2 grown children, 2 sons. She lived a modest life, By all accounts, her church and her faith was important to her, and her friendships with those people that went with her was critical in this case because they sadly were the ones that found her. The last time her son and daughter-in-law saw her alive was on Mother's Day before this happened. So for those of us in this business, why we are here today, whether he's alive or dead, is because we cannot ignore the human toll that violent crime takes upon families and entire communities. It changes the way people raise their children, the jobs they choose, the way they look at people in the grocery store. In this case, law enforcement spent decades looking at different potential suspects. Until that DNA hit came in, the clouds of suspicion remained over those potential suspects. But with that DNA came the lifting of those clouds against people who had never committed this crime. I say this because it's important that we acknowledge that even though it's been 33 years, 11 days, and 11 months and 24 days, which accounts, by the way, of 12,412 days, this woman's family has lived with that for every single day. Their lives have been changed, the way they look at the world, the way they stand in the grocery store, and maybe that's the guy that broke in and killed my mom. That's what they think about. So as we stand here today, it is critical that people understand the reason why we continue and they continue to pursue this case for decades. Because Lucille Holmgren was a mother, she was a wife, she was a 79-year-old woman who lived her life with dignity and respect only to have it taken away by a sex offender who killed her and strangled her and sexually assaulted her. A couple days ago, the Galt police officer, I think it was Detective Fuel, talked to his son, or her son, I'm sorry, Hank, and who happens now to be the same age, I think, 78 or 79, as his mother was at the time she was killed. And his quote to Detective Fuel was, "I'm glad to know the case was solved. I wish the man was still alive to face the consequences. I wish my older brother was still alive to hear the news. Thank you to the Galt Police Department and the Sacramento County Crime Lab for solving my mother's case." I too wish this person was still alive so we could prosecute him and put him in prison. But sometimes justice doesn't lead us that way. But what it does for us here today, it may not be ultimately justice for this family because he's not been arrested and because he's deceased. But for those of us in this business, it is some sense of answers. It'll never be closure, but it is answers. What this case should teach us is not just the value of human life, but the value of passion and persistence, the value of DNA in finding the truth no matter where it leads us. And ultimately, to go back to that quote at the beginning, it was the silent witness that revealed itself in this case. And the person that revealed it for us, that truth, is Lucille herself, because it was the evidence taken from her body that told us who killed her. With that, I will say this. In this world, we often look for needles in haystacks. I've said that before. This was that needle, those fingernail scrapings that ultimately identified the man who sexually assaulted, strangled, and killed this poor woman. Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple things. You may be asking for a photograph of our suspect, Mr. Bramble, and we will put that up on our social media. Our social media and PIO coordinator, Corporal Hansen's in the back of the room, and so you can contact her directly should you need additional information related to that. And with that, I would open it up for any questions.
Is there a possibility that this person...
I'm sorry, there is going to be a microphone that is going to be passed. I apologize. We are live streaming.
Okay.
Yes.
With KCRA, Lizzie, I'm just wondering, is there a possibility, are you looking into whether this suspect may be connected in other cases now with this new DNA evidence? And what can you tell us about that prior case, how much time he served?
Related to other cases that he may be involved in, we are canvassing local jurisdictions to see if there are any common cold cases out there that we can look into, not only here in our community, but in the region. The second issue, that 1992 case, is a San Joaquin County case that's archived, and we're still working to pull that case information to find out the specifics of that case. But it was a attempt sexual assault that occurred in San Joaquin County, and that's the only details I have about that.
Was he incarcerated at the time of his death, and do you guys know a possible motive why he targeted her specifically?
So we do not have any information as to a motive. He was not on our radar as a potential suspect, and he was not incarcerated. He was living under the bridge on Highway 99 for 5 or 6 years prior to his death, and he died of natural causes at that location.
Any other questions?
Hi, it's Alejandra Quesada with Telemundo. And this is for Ms. Schubert. This brings a lot of hope for so many people right now in our communities, thinking maybe one day I'm going to see the person that killed my mom in jail. Tell me, how many cases are you guys working like this? And, I mean, are you close to other cases? Ready to close other cases?
I mean, our office has had a cold case unit for 20 years, and many, many, many cases have been solved. Some of it through the technology, DNA technology that was used in this case, some of it through what we call genetic genealogy, such as the Golden State Killer. I don't think the chief can confirm this. I don't think there's any other cold cases in this city. So that this was the only unsolved for Galt. Okay. So I'm quite sure it's very near and dear to them that this was solved. But we live in a county of over 1 million people. We have multiple jurisdictions, the sheriffs, the police department. I can just tell you, I'm incredibly proud of the work our cold case team does with SAC PD, SAC Sheriff, Folsom, every agency. If we have the evidence, particularly the physical evidence, you can rest assured that these cold case folks and these agencies are going to work those cases. Honestly, not every case is going to get solved. Sometimes you just don't have what you need. But you can rest assured that everything we can do will be done to solve these crimes. So yes, it does provide hope, because it is like finding a needle in a haystack, and we've got to keep looking for that needle. So it does provide hope. I don't want it to be false hopes on cases that cannot be solved, but it does provide hope.
Lizzie, again with KCRA, would you mind explaining a little bit more about kind of the science? What changed? When did that happen? And, had these fingernail scrapings previously been checked? When was that? And then afterwards, if we could hear from the former chief just to get his take on this, that would be great.
I mean, 1988, we didn't have DNA in this forensic world. My own little story is I did my first DNA case in Sacramento in 1997 or so. The kits to do the testing, and we don't have our criminals here, so if I, am inaccurate, hopefully she'll correct me later, but it's evolved in the ability to collect and analyze DNA to the point of the amount you need has become so much more extensive. It used to be, I'm going to age myself here, you had to have about a quarter size of DNA, the size of a sample. Now it's less than 1/1000th of a size of a sweet and low package, 1/100000th. And the fact so it's evolved, the DNA quit markers, the kits have become better, it's much more sensitive, meaning you can get lower and lower amounts. And that's where the fingernail scrapings became the key. I mean, our lab, I have a timeline of stuff, but for years they were looking at all these different things, autopsy kits, all those things to find that thing. And ultimately it was the fingernail scrapings, which had a mixture of the victim, obviously, which you would expect, and the suspect. And that was then allowed to, enough of it because of the sensitivity now of these kits, to upload into the DNA databank and match him because he was on file as a convicted offender. So hopefully that answers it.
Okay, and next, there was a request to hear from former Police Chief Doug Matthews, and so I'll have him come out now.
Thank you. Well, as the district attorney's already spoken about, the technology has changed so much. We did everything we could at the time. It's one of those cases that we had, DNA was just on the horizon, and the evidence that we had was sent in several times between the actual incident and this last cold case, the solving of the case. We're just satisfied that it's completed. We can put it to bed and not keep it in the back of our mind that, you know, there's one that we still have to work on.
Thank you, and I would say that in closing, I think all law enforcement, whether it's our partners with the district attorney's office or Department of Justice or each individual local agency, never forgets about their cold cases and always works hard to make sure that we can get some resolution to that. And this is a prime example under the leadership of our current district attorney. And so on a personal level, I do thank you for your efforts and your team. It's a fabulous organization, and so it's been very helpful. With that, are there any last questions? Not hearing any. Thank you, everybody, for coming today.